Picture the most powerful man on earth, an emperor whose orders could move armies, erase families, and rewrite futures. Now imagine the most dangerous battlefield isn't Greece, it's inside his own palace. Tonight's story is about Xerxes and a scandal that ancient writers tied to the royal women's quarters, what people casually call a harem. But this isn't a romance story. It's a story about control, paranoia, and the kind of punishment that turns private suspicion into public terror. By the end, you'll understand why this tale survived for centuries, and why it still feels unbelievable. Stay with me, because the most shocking part isn't just what happened, it's why it could happen at all. Xerxes I ruled the Achaemenid Persian Empire, one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. From the outside, it looked invincible: governors in distant provinces, elite guards at the capital, gold flowing into royal treasuries, and a king whose title basically meant king of kings. But inside any absolute monarchy, there's a second empire, an invisible one, made of whispers, rivalries, and influence. And that empire lives in the palace. When people say harem today, they usually picture something sensational from movies. Historically, it often meant the royal women's quarters, a highly guarded domestic space where royal wives, female relatives, attendants, and servants lived under strict protocol. It was private, protected, and politically important. Because in royal courts, marriage wasn't just personal. It was diplomacy. Bloodlines were legitimacy. Rumors weren't gossip, they were weapons. And that's how a domestic scandal could become a crisis of state. Before we go further, we have to talk about sources. The most famous dramatic account tied to Xerxes and palace scandal comes from Herodotus, a Greek historian. He's valuable because he preserves stories close to the era, but he's also complicated. He wrote from a Greek perspective, and Greek writers sometimes portrayed Persian court life as exotic, decadent, or morally corrupt. So we should treat the details carefully. Still, Herodotus' palace narratives share a consistent theme: court intrigue plus threatened honor plus brutal punishment, the kind meant not just to hurt someone, but to send a message to everyone watching. That's the core of what Xerxes did. As the story gets retold, it becomes less about love and more about power enforcing fear. To understand what happens next, you need the cast of characters, because in palace politics, motives matter as much as actions. Xerxes, the emperor. His authority is enormous, but his rule depends on elite families, generals, and court networks. The queen, often named a mistress in Greek accounts, described as politically strong and capable of ruthless decisions. Noble families, the empire's power brokers. Their daughters and marriages connect them to the throne. Women in the royal quarters, their lives are controlled by protocol, but they can still become central to political conflict, often as symbols of loyalty, alliance, and legitimacy. And here's the key: in an absolute court, a personal humiliation can be treated like a political attack. According to the ancient story tradition, a boundary is crossed, or at least, a boundary is believed to be crossed, involving attraction, secrecy, and the royal family's honor. And once that happens, the system doesn't respond like a modern family would. It responds like a state defending itself. Because if the court believes the king can be manipulated, distracted, or shamed, that belief spreads. Rival factions move. Loyalists panic. Enemies inside the palace smell weakness. So what begins as something private quickly becomes political. And in that atmosphere, the most dangerous thing you can be is connected. Connected to the wrong person. Seen at the wrong moment. Accused by the wrong faction. That's how court life turns into a trap. Now we get to the part that makes people go silent. In ancient imperial systems, punishments weren't always designed to be fair. They were designed to be effective. They were meant to terrify. The story tied to Xerxes is remembered because it describes punishment that goes beyond a private correction. It becomes a public lesson, a warning that the palace is not a place where mistakes are forgiven, and not a place where rumor can be safely ignored. Some retellings frame it as Xerxes acting directly. Others suggest the queen and court factions drive the harshest outcomes, with the king allowing it, or using it, as a demonstration of control. Either way, the message is the same. When power feels threatened, cruelty can become governance. And once that happens, the royal quarters aren't a home. They're a pressure chamber. This is the part most shock titles skip, the reason behind the brutality. Reputation is security. A king's image isn't ego. It's stability. If the court thinks the king is weak, provinces begin to test him. Court factions are always competing. Every powerful court has groups pulling in different directions. Scandal becomes a tool to gain leverage. Fear is faster than trust. Trust takes years. Fear takes one example. One punishment can silence 100 rivals. Royal women are political symbols. In dynastic systems, Women can represent alliances between families. Accusing, humiliating, or punishing them can be a strike against an entire network. So the horrifying actions aren't random. They follow a cold logic. The palace protects itself by destroying perceived threats. Let's be honest, we don't have a palace security camera from 2,500 years ago. The most detailed scandal narratives come from Greek authors like Herodotus, who may amplify drama and moralize Persian court life. Persian royal inscriptions and official art don't tell these kinds of domestic stories. So the safest way to present this is: ancient accounts describe brutal court punishments and intense palace intrigue. The exact details are debated, and some may be exaggerated. But the broader pattern, absolute power, harsh discipline, and political rivalry, is historically believable across many empires. That balance keeps your story gripping without turning it into pure fiction. So, what did Xerxes do to his royal harem women? If we follow the ancient tradition, he presided over, allowed, endorsed, or weaponized a palace system where suspected scandal could lead to extreme punishment, used to enforce fear and protect authority. And whether every detail is literal or not, the story survives because it captures a timeless truth. Absolute power doesn't just rule armies. It rules bodies, reputations, and silence. To really understand why this story turns so dark, you have to understand the environment. The royal women's quarters weren't just rooms in a palace. They were a controlled institution, guarded, managed, and watched. In many ancient royal courts, privacy was a luxury almost nobody had. Schedules were structured. Movement was restricted. Access was political. Even being seen near the wrong person could turn into a report, and a report could turn into an accusation. And when you live in a system like that, three things happen. 1. People learn to survive by loyalty signals. Not loyalty in your heart, loyalty you can prove.
Who you greet. Who you avoid. Who you serve first.
Which names you mention. Which names you never say out loud. 2. Rumors become currency. In normal life, rumors are entertainment. In a palace, rumors are leverage. If someone can damage your position with a whisper, they can also protect you, for a price. 3. Everyone becomes a potential target. Because palace scandals aren't treated like personal mistakes. They're treated like threats to the dynasty. So when the ancient accounts describe a scandal spiraling into harsh punishment, it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from a place where fear is baked into the system. Now here's the part people miss. The king doesn't need to personally hunt anyone down to create terror. If the palace believes the king will approve brutal outcomes, or even just allow them, then the machine runs on its own. And that's what makes Xerxes-era court stories so chilling. Because even if you never spoke to the king, even if you never broke a rule, you could still end up paying the price for someone else's war inside the palace. Here's where the story stops being palace gossip and starts looking like a political crisis. In the ancient accounts, Xerxes isn't operating in a vacuum. He's surrounded by a court system where powerful families are tied to the throne through marriage, and where the queen's position isn't ceremonial, it's strategic. When you place those forces in the same room, one scandal can ignite 3 different wars at once.
War number 1. The king versus humiliation.
For an absolute ruler, humiliation isn't personal embarrassment. It's a threat to authority. If the court believes the king can be emotionally manipulated, or that his household is out of control, it sends a signal: his grip is slipping. And in a massive empire, that perception can be dangerous. So the king's ego becomes political infrastructure. Protecting it becomes policy. War number 2. The queen versus rival influence. Greek writers, especially Herodotus, often portray the queen, commonly named a mistress, as someone who could be intensely protective of her status and ruthless toward threats. Whether every detail is literal or dramatized, the theme is consistent across many royal courts. A queen's power is tied to legitimacy, lineage, and control of the household. If someone inside the royal quarters is perceived as a rival, someone who could pull attention, influence, or future succession in a different direction, the queen has every incentive to crush that risk early. And in a system without public accountability, crushing a risk can look horrifying. War number 3. Noble families versus
each other.
Now add the nobles. In empires like Persia, elite families weren't background characters. They were pillars holding up the state. Their daughters could be marriage links to the throne. Their sons could be commanders, governors, administrators. So if a scandal touches a noble house, it becomes bigger than one person's reputation. It becomes a clash between networks. Who gets closer to the throne? Who loses favor? Who becomes unsafe to associate with? And once that begins, accusations don't need proof, only momentum. The dark mechanism. This is the mechanism that turns a rumor into a nightmare. Suspicion spreads inside the royal quarters. Factions interpret the suspicion in their own favor. The king's image becomes at risk. A brutal example becomes the fastest way to restore fear and control. So when you hear the title, "What Xerxes Did to His Royal Harem," women will leave you speechless. This is the real backbone behind it. Not just a shocking act, but a system where private life is political, desire becomes danger, and punishment becomes propaganda. And now the most important question. If the goal is to restore control, what kind of punishment would be loud enough that nobody dares to repeat the mistake? In a modern legal system, punishment is supposed to be about guilt, evidence, and fairness. In an ancient imperial court, punishment was often about something else.
Control.
That doesn't mean every ruler was automatically cruel, or that every case was lawless. But in many absolute monarchies, especially inside the palace, the justice system had a second job. 1. It had to protect the dynasty. Anything that looked like a threat to lineage, loyalty, or succession could be treated like state danger. If the royal household looked unstable, it could encourage rebellion outside the palace walls. So palace punishments weren't only aimed at the person accused. They were aimed at everyone watching. 2. It had to scare the court into obedience.
A court is full of ambitious people.
Some want closeness to the king. Some want to pull the king toward their faction. Some want to destroy rivals quietly. Fear is the fastest way to freeze that movement. One harsh, unforgettable case can accomplish what 100 speeches can't. It stops rumors from spreading further. It warns servants and officials not to take sides. It tells noble families that their status does not protect them. 3. It had to restore the king's image. A king's reputation in court isn't PR. It's stability. If the king looks weak or distracted, people behave differently, more daring, more disloyal, more opportunistic. So an extreme act can function like a stamp. Authority is intact. How this connects to the Xerxes story. This is why the Xerxes palace scandal tradition is remembered as shocking. Not because the ancient world lacked violence. Wars were brutal, punishments could be harsh. But because the story focuses on the palace, on a place that's supposed to be protected, controlled, and prestigious. And in the narrative tradition, the punishment becomes almost theatrical, a deliberate demonstration that no one inside the household is untouchable. The speechless detail without turning it into exploitation. A lot of viral retellings chase the most graphic version possible. I'm not going to do that, because it often crosses into invented content, it becomes exploitative, and it ruins credibility. Instead, here's the historically responsible way to say it in narration. Ancient accounts describe severe, humiliating punishments used as warnings inside the royal household, punishments meant to end the scandal by terrifying everyone connected to it. That keeps the impact, without pretending we can verify every sensational detail. The real horror. The system works even if the king does nothing. Here's the coldest part. In a palace like this, the king doesn't need to personally plan every punishment. If the court believes harsh outcomes are acceptable, the machine runs automatically. A rival pushes an accusation. Officials move to protect themselves. Allies distance themselves. The target becomes isolated. And then the punishment becomes inevitable. That's why court scandals were deadly. Not because everyone was evil, because everyone was afraid. Now we zoom out, because if you end the video only on shock, people leave with a rumor, not a story. The Xerxes harem scandal tradition survives largely because it sits at the perfect intersection of three things ancient writers loved to emphasize: an all-powerful king, a ruthless palace, and punishment that feels unbelievable. But there's a responsible way to separate what's solid from what's sensational.
What's solid?
1. Xerxes was real, and his power was massive. He ruled the Achaemenid Empire at its height, and the Persian court was a highly structured political institution. 2. Royal households were political. Marriages and family ties were state matters. The royal quarters were guarded and managed, not a free-for-all. 3. Ancient empires used harsh punishments. Across the ancient world, severe punishments were often used as deterrents and as demonstrations of authority.
What's debated?
The most dramatic palace scandal details, especially the ones that circulate online in extra graphic form, are hard to verify independently. Much of what people repeat comes through Greek narrative tradition, especially Herodotus, who may have heard court stories secondhand, shaped them for moral lessons, or emphasized exotic Persia to entertain Greek audiences. So in your narration, the smartest phrasing is, ancient Greek sources describe. Herodotus claims. Historians debate the details. That makes your video feel more credible, not less. The deeper truth the story captures. Even if some details are embellished, the story hits a real historical pattern. When power is absolute and accountability is low, the palace becomes a place where reputation is life or death, women are treated as political assets, and cruelty becomes a tool of governance. That's why the story still lands. It's not just Xerxes was cruel. It's the system rewarded cruelty. Ending that drives watch time plus comments. Here's an ending you can read word for word. So if you came here expecting a simple scandal story, here's the darker reality. In an absolute court, scandal isn't personal.
It's political.
And that's why the ancient accounts hit so hard, because the punishment wasn't just for the accused. It was for everyone watching. Now here's the question. Do you think these stories are mostly Greek propaganda, or do you think palace life really was this brutal behind closed doors? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want the next episode, we can dig into how Persian royal propaganda portrayed kingship versus how Greek writers portrayed it. So let's lock it in. Xerxes ruled an empire where the palace wasn't just a home, it was a power system. The royal women's quarters weren't a fantasy world. They were a political space, guarded by protocol and fueled by rival networks. And when a scandal, or even the suspicion of one, touched the royal household, ancient accounts describe punishment so severe it wasn't meant to be fair. It was meant to be unforgettable. That's why this story survives, not because it's only shocking, but because it shows what happens when reputation becomes law. And here's the part that should bother you most. In systems like this, you don't have to be guilty to be destroyed, you only have to be connected to the wrong person at the wrong time. That's the world Xerxes ruled, or at least, the world ancient writers wanted us to see. If you want more palace stories where history and propaganda collide, subscribe, because next time we'll look at how empires controlled the narrative, and how much of what we think we know is shaped by the people who wrote it down. Now tell me in the comments, was this mostly Greek exaggeration, or a real glimpse into how royal courts enforced fear?